On the occasion of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly's October 2021 issue, we're in conversation with Nathan Kravis about his paper, Charisma. I'm going to read his biography to you before we share the interview. Nathan Kravis is clinical professor of psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College, associate director of the DeWitt Wallace Institute of Psychiatry at Cornell, training and supervising analyst at the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research, and a former associate editor of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. He is the author of On the Couch, A Repressed History of the Analytic Couch from Plato to Freud. Other recent publications include The Analyst's Hatred of Analysis and The Googled and Googling Analyst. He is the recipient of teaching awards from the psychiatry residents at Cornell and psychoanalytic candidates at Columbia, the George E. Daniels Merit Award of the Association for Psychoanalytic Medicine, the George S. Goldman Award of the Columbia Psychoanalytic Center, and the Arnold M. Cooper MD Memorial Award from the Weill Cornell Department of Psychiatry for contributions to psychodynamic psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and historical scholarship. He has been in private practice in New York since 1987. I just want to start with asking, sort of some of the basics, which is, what inspired writing this paper? And I guess maybe when exactly did you start writing it? Maybe we start with that, and then, or start researching and thinking about this paper, and what was the impetus and inspiration for it, and sort of thinking about bringing a psychoanalytic perspective to this sort of socio-political phenomena.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And I just want to take a second to say thanks also to Lucy Lafarge, the editor-in-chief of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, for inviting me to do this with you. I started working on this several years ago because I began to think that, when we look at the current political landscape and our current cultural and societal surround, it's kind of hard to avoid thinking about what is often referred to as the dark side of charisma. Because I think we all see that charismatic leaders can be dangerous or destructive. And while a lot of interesting and important work has been done on the topic of malignant narcissism, like by Dr. Otto Kernberg and others, I came to feel that when it comes to wondering why we so readily impute charisma to others, whether they are political or religious leaders, they could be cult leaders, athletes, rock stars, celebrities. As psychoanalysts, I thought we should be able to say more about the general craving for charismatic authority. And, certain aspects of individual psychopathology, like narcissism and sociopathy, are certainly important. They don't, and they can't really explain or address the social and cultural phenomenon of our tendency to anoint so many people and so many different kinds of people charismatic. In fact, I think the first thing you notice about any list of charismatic figures that any of us might generate is how wildly heterogeneous that list is. There's such a dizzying degree of variance with respect to intellect, moral courage, talent, beauty, charm, fraudulence, sociopathy. The only meaningful unifying thread here is the fact of followership. So why do we predicate charisma of so many people? And why in particular, Terry, do so many malignant narcissists manage to be deemed charismatic? What are they tapping into? And under what conditions do they proliferate and thrive? And I began to think, well, we can, as psychoanalysts, talk in our familiar terms about idealization and projection. But that really doesn't get us very far in addressing these particular questions. Other disciplines, like theology and classical and contemporary sociology, have in their various ways looked at these questions. And in my paper, I try to show how I think psychoanalysts can both benefit from and deepen the contributions of these other disciplines. So building that bridge was an important aim of mine in writing this paper.
And with the dark side, you mentioned in the paper that you feel like psychoanalysts have something to offer here that has yet to really be fully sort of sussed out in a rigorous way.
Yeah, and let me give you an example of what I mean by, a sort of bridge between, say, sociology and psychoanalysis, and what I think psychoanalysis really can add. So when I started to read the writings of the great sociologist Max Weber on the topic of charisma, because he really wrote a lot about that topic over 100 years ago. He was writing, in the late 19th, early 20th century. One of the things I came across that was really arresting to me was this passage in which Weber says that devotion to the charismatic leader is a devotion born of distress and enthusiasm. And I realized, and maybe this is what Weber was implying all along, and I was just a little slow to pick up on it, that distress and enthusiasm go hand in hand. And I think that has huge implications for leadership, followership dynamics. And I think it has implications that are political, economic, cultural, and historical in ways that are, as I said, our familiar constructs of idealization and projection don't fully capture. And I believe it has important clinical implications as well. So thinking psychoanalytically, I think that one thing that we psychoanalysts can contribute to the exploration of charismatic leadership and charismatic authority is the realization that charisma is really an emergent property of the intersubjective field. Because sure, the charismatic leader may be charming, oratorically gifted, perhaps narcissistic and manipulative, but those are just, the necessary but not sufficient conditions. Followers must predicate charisma. The followers have to bestow upon or endow the leader with charisma. And followers and leaders are subject to mutual influence, so that the movements are often shaped by the followership and sometimes spin out of the control of the charismatic leader. So that was something that really intrigued me and that I saw as, an important area of dialogue between sociology and psychoanalysis.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, the distress and enthusiasm aspect when I was reading the paper really resonated in thinking about everything from, recent politics and, obviously Trump, we're not going to go deep into that, but that happened. And then, things like cults and stuff, like where there is this, someone who feels content and calm is less likely to be upregulated by someone who is charismatic and is trying to lead them.
Right. And that, Terry, that's exactly what was so important to me about Weber's phrase, distress and enthusiasm, and its importance as a determinant of devotion to the charismatic leader, because I realized that enthusiasm is maybe one possible solution to the problem posed by certain forms of distress, be they economic, political, or interpersonal. And this is when I really became convinced that theology, sociology, and psychoanalysis have something to say to one another. And like I said, a major aim in writing this paper was to build that bridge. Because I mean, I think that these are disciplines that rarely speak to one another, yet to me have a lot to say to one another. So, you know, to flesh this out a little bit, I think theology and sociology help us see that charisma has an important social or interpersonal function that really transcends individual psychology. And psychoanalysis, for its part, helps us see that charisma is best understood not as a personality type or personality trait, but like I said, as an emergent property of the intersubjective field. And I think psychoanalysis also contributes a way of conceptualizing the aggressive and sometimes destructive direction that charismatic leadership can veer off into, the way charismatic leaders can become the carriers of aggressive or violent urges, and how they can sometimes express publicly what the followers might not express in their own personal interactions. And I think racism, homophobia, misogyny, and other forms of othering can find expression in this way.
Two things I'm thinking about from the paper. One is just and actually one of the readers was curious about this, who read your paper. But like, what were the challenges of, it's like you've got so many moving parts with all of these different disciplines. So what were the challenges of creating like structure or intersectionally, like dealing with all of these disciplines in one paper? What were the challenges, and did you learn anything about your own practice or about your writing in that process?
Well, it was both daunting and exciting to try to, integrate the findings from different disciplines and try to pull it all together in one paper in a way that is readable and flows and makes sense to the reader. So that was a huge challenge, but it was also a really exciting undertaking. And one of the things I realized about that was that I really had to carefully spell out what I think is at stake in Weber's notion of charismatic authority, because he writes a lot about that. And where I kind of differ a little bit and find a way to turn that into a more psychoanalytic construct, which I call charismatic organization. And I'll say something about that. But one of the things that I saw in delving into, now I'm shifting more from classical to contemporary sociology. One of the things I saw in delving into the recent literature in sociology and in management theory is that in the past 20 years or so, there's really been a shift in emphasis from a sole focus on the personality type or management style of the charismatic leader to a focus on leadership followership dynamics. And I realized that this in many ways represents a refinding of some of the things that Weber was saying 100 years ago. So for example, Weber said, when he was talking about charismatic authority, that unlike traditional authority or legal or bureaucratic authority. Charismatic authority is not a matter of expertise or qualifications or credentials or even of competence. It's that the charismatic leader is endowed by the followers with qualities that are perceived to be extraordinary, sometimes supernatural or magical, qualities that for various reasons, and this goes back to distress, are widely felt to be needed to deal with a certain crisis or danger, whether perceived or real, or to fulfill a craving to connect with someone who seems extraordinary or enchanted or, magical in some way. And so followers in this way bestow and often abruptly withdraw the predication of charisma. So, that's when I began to think that, yeah, sure, that the charismatic leader may be charming and rhetorically brilliant and so on, maybe narcissistic, but it's really the followers who must predicate charisma of that leader and must, bestow upon or endow that leader with charisma. And then, the followership often has a big role in shaping the movement or, the cause, and that can spin out of the control of the charismatic leader. So in that sense, it's bidirectional.
Right. And you mentioned in the paper, I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of, it's also like they endow the charismatic leader with that role or authority, in part because they think that person can kind of swiftly get some things done. And often when the thing is done, then it disappears or falls apart as quickly as it.
Yeah. Which is why we sometimes see that some charismatic leaders have a sort of meteoric rise and then, quickly implode or self-destruct or lose their followership.
Can you, because you did a lot of research into the histories, like in religion, in Christianity, of sort of charismatic, and there is sort of the charismatic Christian, like speaking in tongues and things like that. And I feel like that gives a pretty concrete example of that back and forth, right? And there's sort of like this sort of controlling of the enthusiasm to some degree, or can you go into that a little bit about?
Yeah, sure.
Because you kind of start the paper with that.
Yes.
Pretty early.
Yeah, because one of my aha moments in researching this paper was actually in reading St. Paul. The word charisma does not appear in the Gospels at all, but it appears quite frequently in the letters of Paul. In fact, in the entire New Testament, there are like 17 mentions of the word charisma, and 16 of them are in St. Paul. There's one sort of faint echo of Paul in a letter by Peter, but it's really Paul who develops the specifically Christian connotation of charisma. And what Paul says is that, especially like when you read Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, you know how there's that famous passage that is so often quoted in wedding ceremonies where he says, love is patient, love is kind. And, I realized, especially when you put it in the context of what surrounds it and look at, the other passages elsewhere where Paul is talking about the charismata, the gifts of grace, I realized that Paul is not, when he says love is patient, love is kind, he's not dispensing marital advice to newlyweds. That's not what he means. What he really means is that the charismata, the gifts of grace, are not for self-aggrandizement. They're there for community building. They're there to edify and teach others. And that made me sort of opened up to me the idea that charisma, I think Paul was saying, really has a social or interpersonal function. And that was an important starting point. And, he was saying that, the reason he was saying that in 1 Corinthians is because of the sort of glossolalia pandemic in Corinth, that he needed to rein in and say to people, look, it's great that you're inspired. It's great that you receive divine revelation, but let's keep in mind what the purpose of that gift really is. It's not for self-display. If it's for self-display, then it is being used lovelessly. That's what he meant in saying love is patient, love is kind. That's the kind of love he was talking about. He was talking about the social good. And anyway, that was important to me because it got me thinking along the lines of the interpersonal and the social function of the predication of charisma. Weber termed charismatic authority. I prefer to talk about as what I call charismatic organization. And I prefer the term charismatic organization because, first of all, because it avoids the essentialist trap of, locating charisma as an inherent personality trait in a sort of one-person psychology objectivist manner. But also, so I wanted a construct like charismatic organization to leave room for the bidirectionality of leadership followership dynamics. And also the construct of charismatic organization leaves room for us to take into account the interpersonal and the sociocultural, not just the intrapsychic. And so, what I wanted to say about this is that the emergence of charismatic organization under the pressure of distress and enthusiasm, to go back to Weber's formulation, again, whether that distress is economic, political, or psychological, can be seen both in the clinical encounter between analyst and patient and on the larger stage of socio-political phenomena. And here's where I really became interested in trying to map the intersection of Weber's stipulation of enthusiasm and distress and Bion's stipulation of arrogance and stupidity in the analyst, something I try to illustrate in my clinical vignette. And there I give an example of what happened between me and a patient who I found quite charismatic. And I try to show how the emergence of what I call charismatic organization transiently compromised my work with this patient, and how under the pressure of distress and enthusiasm, to use Weber's hauntingly prescient phrase from 100 years ago, analyst and patient together descend into a form of stupidity as stipulated by Bion. And I think it's important to note, and I try to highlight this in my clinical vignette, how gratifying this descent into stupidity can be for both analyst and patient, though, of course, it comes at great cost. And I think that this feature of charismatic organization, which reflects what Bion theorized as the hatred of thinking, is what we can discern on both the small scale of the analytic dyad and the larger scale of the socio-political world today.
Yeah, and I found that so interesting in the vignette. You mentioned, I think, like, so there's sort of an anti-elitism. I think some, this sort of like innate, like, or need for an anti-elitism. And the one thing you talked about with and I'm not an analyst in any way, shape, or form, but I remember something about, like, in the absence of being able to make a real connection, this dynamic of charismatic organization sort of took over. Is that accurate? And could you go into that a little more?
Yeah, sure. So what I'm trying to say about that is that might be a kind of distress felt by analyst and patient, the difficulty forming a rapport or connecting with one another, and being self-reflective in a creative way together. Sometimes when the path to that is blocked, analyst and patient may jointly have recourse, under the pressure of the distress of feeling that blocked, have recourse to a form of enthusiasm characterized by pseudo excitement. And that pseudo excitement can involve a discarding of analytic thinking and can reflect what Bion calls the hatred of thinking. But what I wish to add in putting forward my notion of charismatic organization as a clinical construct is a fuller consideration of how and why certain kinds of countertransference enactments feel warranted and seem warranted to the analyst under the circumstances and feel gratifying to the analyst, because charismatic organization functions as kind of a stabilizing structure, at least for a time, because it contains the sort of bidirectional flow of idealizations and projections, while, as I said earlier, also sustaining, at least temporarily, a suspension of thinking that is also often experienced as gratifying. I think in the clinical situation, the construct that I'm trying to put forward of charismatic organization helps us see something about the susceptibility of both parties, analyst and patient, to lapse into hatred of thinking that can be characterized by a denial of reality, denial of limitations, escape from limitations even, and a postponement or warding off of loss, disappointment, and therefore a warding off of the work of mourning. So we see how that can be a susceptibility of analyst and patient to fall into together. And I try to show with my clinical vignette how one of the signals that can be occurring is what I call micro-transgressions, moments in which the analyst senses him or herself departing from or discarding analytic competence and analytic ways of thinking and responding. So I hope that's a somewhat helpful addition to the way we think about working with patients, often in the cases I'm discussing, narcissistic patients. But I also think that the larger point here is to see how charismatic organization permits both parties to indulge their hatred of thinking, if you will. And in fact, it supports their doing so. And so I think in this respect, through the prism of charismatic organization, we can see how some features of the clinical encounter and the larger scale socio-political phenomena reflect and mirror each other.